He was born in a world that did not want him. In the year 1162, on the remote grasslands of the Mongolian steppe, a child entered the world gripping a clot of blood in his tiny fist. Among the nomads, this was an omen, either greatness or destruction. But for the infant named Temüjin, destiny offered both. His birth brought no celebration. The steppe was a ruthless cradle, where power was fragile and alliances dissolved as easily as morning mist. Temüjin's father, Yesugei, was a respected chieftain, but even he walked carefully among rival clans who treated loyalty as a currency to be traded, not kept. Only a few years after Temüjin's birth, fate struck its first blow. During a journey, Yesugei shared a meal with members of the Tatar tribe, ancient enemies of his people. The offered food concealed poison. By the time he returned to his family, his strength was fading. Within days, he was dead. And with his death, the world around Temüjin collapsed. Among the Mongols, leadership had to be earned, not inherited. And with a boy heir, Yesugei's followers wasted no time abandoning his widow and children. Overnight, Temüjin's family fell from a respected household to wandering outcasts. The very people who once pledged loyalty to Yesugei took their livestock, tents, and weapons, leaving the family with nothing but the bitter wind. Temüjin's mother, Holan, carried the weight of survival alone. She taught her children to dig roots from frozen soil, trap small animals, and endure hunger without complaint. Those early years carved something deep into Temüjin, a cold understanding that no one would ever come to save him. The world respected power, not birthright. One memory stayed with him for life. His half-brother Beta, older and stronger, used his size to dominate the younger children. In the steppe's unforgiving logic, food meant survival, and Beta took more than his share. The resentment simmered, until one day, Temüjin made a choice that would haunt him. He drew his bow and killed Beta. It was a crime. Among the nomads, fratricide was a stain few could wash away. But it revealed something essential about Temüjin. When cornered, he chose action, not hesitation. Even as a boy, he understood that survival demanded decisions others feared to make. Yet the world had not finished testing him. A few years later, members of the Temüjin clan captured him, men loyal to the old aristocratic order who saw Temüjin as a threat. They bound him in a wooden collar and paraded him like a prisoner. But one night, a poor household guard showed mercy, allowing him to slip away. Temüjin remembered this kindness for the rest of his life. In a world ruled by noble bloodlines, it was the ordinary people, the herders, the hunters, the overlooked who sheltered him. This lesson would shape the army he later built: loyalty over lineage, discipline over privilege. By the time Temüjin reached adulthood, he had known hunger, humiliation, betrayal, and the fragile warmth of unexpected compassion. The boy born holding blood had become a man forged in hardship. But the world had not yet seen what he would become. This is only the beginning. The steppe was changing, old powers were trembling, and Temüjin was preparing to challenge everything the Mongols believed about leadership, loyalty, and destiny. By the time Temüjin entered his teenage years, he had already learned the two laws of the steppe. Trust is fragile, and power belongs to those who can hold it. His early life had stripped him of everything a young Mongol warrior should have had: horses, weapons, allies, even the protection of a clan. But what Temüjin lacked in status, he compensated for with a relentless instinct for survival. After escaping from the Temüjin, he returned to his family with a new sense of purpose. Hunger still stalked their camp, but Temüjin now possessed the one thing he had never truly known before: confidence. He had defied men stronger than him, outrun hunters, endured humiliation, and lived. The steppe had thrown him into the crucible, and he had emerged tempered. But even a tempered man needed allies. In those years, Temüjin looked back toward the people his father once trusted. One name stood out above all others: Tochru, the powerful Khan of the Keriet tribe. Yesugei had once helped Togrul reclaim his throne. Mongol custom demanded that debts of this kind were never forgotten, and so Temüjin made a bold decision. Barely a man, riding a single horse with little more than a few offerings, he approached Togrul to ask for support. It was a gamble. Many Khans would have dismissed him as a beggar. But Togrul remembered Yesugei. He remembered the loyalty, the danger shared, the years spent fighting side by side. History turned on small hinges, and this was one of them. Togrul embraced the young man and declared, "You are my son." For the first time in his life, Temüjin had a protector. But another alliance, one shaped by fate rather than politics, would define his future. As a child, Temüjin had been promised in marriage to a girl named Borte from the Kongarad tribe. Marriage, on the steppe, was more than companionship. It was a contract between clans, a bridge between past and future. When Temüjin arrived at the Kongarad camp, Borte's family welcomed him warmly, recognizing both his potential and the weight of his lineage. Borte herself brought something few historical figures receive: genuine loyalty. Yet the steppe allowed happiness only briefly. Word of Temüjin's growing alliances spread quickly, especially among tribes who feared a resurgence of Yesugei's bloodline. Old enemies, especially the Merkit, still remembered the day Yesugei had stolen Holon Temüjin's mother from one of their villages. To them, this was a blood debt waiting to be repaid. One night, as the camp slept, Merkit riders stormed across the plains. They seized Borte and disappeared into the darkness. Temüjin returned too late to stop them. He had lived through abandonment, imprisonment, and starvation, but this loss cut deeper than anything that had come before. His response revealed a new side of him. Temüjin did not retreat into despair. He summoned every connection he had: Togrul and his childhood friend Jamukha, who by then had become a rising noble among the Mongols. The steppe had not seen these three leaders fight on the same side for years, but Temüjin's plea for help to rescue a single woman was so earnest, so unwavering, that they agreed. And so a coalition was born. Their combined armies descended on the Merkit with speed and precision. The attack was devastating. Borte was found alive, shaken but unharmed, and returned to Temüjin. The relief was overwhelming, but beneath it lay something more important. This campaign proved that Temüjin could call upon powerful allies, and that those allies would answer. Yet victory planted a seed of danger. Jamukha, watching Temüjin's influence grow, began to view his old friend not as a companion but as a rival. The steppe was shifting, and the world was preparing for a conflict that would tear apart ancient traditions and reshape Mongol society forever. For a brief moment, the steppe felt stable. Temüjin had reclaimed Borte, renewed the honor of his household, and proven that he could raise an army when needed. He had the protection of Togrul, the loyalty of his family, and even the friendship of Jamukha, though that bond was growing thinner with each passing season. The three men represented three visions of the Mongol future: Togrul, the aging monarch of old traditions; Jamukha, the noble aristocrat who believed in blood-right rule; Temüjin, the outsider who had risen from starvation to leadership through merit, not lineage. On the steppe, such differences could not coexist for long. The final fracture between Temüjin and Jamukha began, fittingly, over loyalty. After the rescue of Borte, many ordinary families, hunters, shepherds, runaways, began drifting toward Temüjin's camp. They admired his fairness, his discipline, and his willingness to reward loyalty regardless of ancestry. This was unheard of in Mongol society, which had long been dominated by aristocratic clans who guarded their privileges fiercely. Jamukha watched this with growing discomfort. He saw men of humble birth defect to Temüjin, leaving the old noble houses behind. It was not just a personal insult, it was a threat to the entire social order he believed in. Then, in the spring of 1187, Temüjin's followers made a symbolic declaration. They lifted him upon a black carpet and proclaimed him Khan, independent of Jamukha and the old aristocracy. It was not a grand coronation. No drums, no banners, just a circle of men who believed in a leader forged by hardship rather than birth. Jamukha responded with ceremony. His own supporters, wealthy, well-bred, confident in tradition, also raised him as Khan, reaffirming the noble lineage of the Golden Clan. 2 Khans, 2 visions, 1 step. A civil war was inevitable. The conflict began with a grim warning. In a raid near the Onon River, Jamukha's men captured several young followers of Temüjin. Instead of simple execution, they tortured them, boiling them alive in cauldrons. The message was clear. This was no mere political rivalry. It was a war for the soul of the Mongols, a war between the old world and the new. Temüjin was furious, not only at the brutality but at the idea that Mongol warriors, people of the same land, the same blood, were destroying each other in such grotesque ways. Violence was expected. Torture was not. It violated the silent code of the steppe. When battle finally erupted, Temüjin fought with a clarity of purpose that few had seen before. Though his forces were smaller, they were organized, loyal, and guided by a leader who understood the stakes. He was not fighting to defend a noble house. He was fighting to redefine what leadership meant. But Jamukha's numbers were too large. His aristocratic allies, bound by centuries of alliance, overwhelmed Temüjin's forces in the early clashes. The first war ended not with Temüjin's death, but with his withdrawal. He refused to surrender and refused to bend the knee. He simply melted back into the wilderness, carrying with him the men who chose to stand by him. Some historians describe this period as his years in the shadows. But in truth, these were the years in which Temüjin hardened into the leader he would become. It was in defeat, not victory, that he learned to trust only those who earned it, not those who inherited it. It was in exile that his reputation quietly spread. A man betrayed, bruised, but unbroken. The civil war had ended, but the rivalry had only begun. And the next time Temüjin rose, he would change the steppe forever. Defeat on the steppe was rarely gentle. A beaten Khan often met his end through execution, enslavement, or quiet disappearance into the wilderness. Yet Temüjin's survival after the First Civil War was neither luck nor mercy. It was the result of a truth the nobles had not yet understood. Temüjin's strength did not come from aristocrats. It came from ordinary people. As he retreated from Jamukha's superior forces, families, poor herders, hunters, widows, craftsmen followed him willingly. They had tasted his leadership and found something the old aristocracy rarely offered: fairness. In a world ruled by bloodlines, Temüjin offered a radical alternative, a society where loyalty mattered more than lineage. During his years in relative obscurity, he reshaped this small but devoted following into something unprecedented. Most Mongol leaders divided their men by clan and lineage. Temüjin rejected this. He organized his followers into units of 10, 100, 1,000, breaking apart clan loyalties and mixing men from different tribes. To the nobility, this seemed reckless, even dangerous. To Temüjin, it was liberation. He understood something few Mongol leaders had ever articulated. The steppe was tired of being ruled by families who inherited authority, but rarely earned respect. The people wanted stability, justice, and predictable leadership qualities that Temüjin had learned not from privilege, but from hardship. His camp became a haven for those mistreated by their former nobles. It was said that even fugitives and abandoned slaves found protection under his banner. Temüjin did not ask who they were. He asked what they could do. This simple shift, merit over birth, formed the backbone of the empire he would one day build. But ideas alone were not enough. Power required alliances, and Temüjin began forging them with a precision that revealed both his humility and his ambition. He rekindled his bond with Togrul, treating the older Khan with genuine respect. In return, he was granted legitimacy, weapons, and space to grow. It would not last forever, but for now, Toghrul served as a protective shield, while Temüjin consolidated strength. At the same time, Temüjin worked quietly to rebuild relationships with clans across the steppe. He visited small camps, honored old debts, and shared plunder fairly, something most Khans never bothered to do. The message spread: Temüjin is a man you can trust, and a leader who rewards loyalty. As his reputation grew, so did the unease among the aristocratic clans. Jamukha, still the favored noble leader, mocked Temüjin's followers as low-born, calling them the mud beneath our horses. But this insult only fueled the loyalty of those who had been dismissed by the old order. Temüjin offered them honor, Jamukha offered them disdain. Conflict between the two men remained inevitable, but its spark came unexpectedly. In 1194, the Jin dynasty of northern China sought allies against a powerful rival, the Tatars. Temüjin and Toghrul seized the opportunity. They joined the Jin attack, defeated the Tatars, and reaped both weapons and prestige. But among the spoils of victory was something more dangerous: a title. The Jin recognized Toghrul as a legitimate ruler, and, by extension, acknowledged Temüjin's authority as well. Recognition from a foreign empire was a political earthquake on the steppe, where legitimacy had always been internal. Jamukha saw this for what it was: the beginning of Temüjin's rise beyond the reach of aristocratic control. The balance of power had shifted. The old world trembled, and the new world sharpened its blades. Temüjin had returned from exile stronger than before, not with noble titles, but with a loyal army, a unifying vision, and a destiny shaped by the harshness of his youth. The steppe was moving toward another war, one that would determine which man would rule all of Mongolia. By the final years of the 12th century, the Mongol steppe was slowly dividing into two visions of the future. On one side stood Jamukha, proud, aristocratic, secure in the traditions that had governed the Mongols for generations. On the other side stood Temüjin, an outsider who had clawed his way from poverty to leadership through loyalty, discipline, and the backing of ordinary herdsmen who believed in him. But it was a single act of betrayal that lit the fuse for war. Around 1196, several clans once firm supporters of Jamukha secretly defected to Temüjin. These defections were not driven by bribes or promises, they were driven by Jamukha's crushing arrogance. He demanded loyalty but gave nothing in return. Temüjin, meanwhile, listened to grievances, punished misrule, and distributed spoils with fairness unseen among the aristocracy. When news reached Jamukha that his former allies had joined Temüjin, his fury was immediate. To him, it was not politics, it was treason. And in retaliation, his men slaughtered the families who had defected, women, children, the elderly. Their bodies were left exposed to the wind. This massacre crossed a line even hardened nomads felt deeply. The steppe could tolerate war but not cruelty against innocents. Temüjin, upon hearing what had happened, did not respond with speeches. He quietly gathered his followers, now thousands strong, and told them the truth. This was no longer a conflict between two rival leaders. It was a struggle over the very identity of the Mongol people. Would Mongolia remain a land ruled by noble clans who lived through privilege? Or would it become a land where loyalty, justice, and competence decided who deserved to lead? The answer would be decided on the battlefield. The Second Civil War began in 1201, and it was unlike anything the Mongols had ever experienced. Temüjin's army was smaller but disciplined. His units of tens, hundreds, and thousands moved with precision. Orders were relayed clearly, soldiers rotated positions during battle, and scouts surveyed terrain with methodical attention. Jamukha's forces, though larger, were fragmented, each clan fighting according to its own customs, each noble demanding authority. Their unity was a facade. A violent storm marked the start of one of their earliest clashes. According to the secret history of the Mongols, lightning struck Jamukha's standard as battle began, a bad omen that shook the morale of his warriors. Temüjin pressed forward, coordinating attacks that exploited weaknesses in Jamukha's formation. It was not brute strength that won the day. It was structure, discipline, and tactical clarity. Slowly, the tide of war turned. More clans defected to Temüjin, attracted by his order and fairness. And for the first time, Mongol society saw something new. People choosing their leader not because of ancestry, but because of trust. Still, Jamukha fought fiercely. His core supporters were noble houses whose pride was wounded by the rise of a man of common lineage. They believed surrender to Temüjin meant surrendering the world they knew. And so they fought on, even as the earth shifted beneath them. The final blow came near the Khangai Mountains. Temüjin's forces encircled Jamukha's remaining loyalists. Those not killed surrendered, one by one. They threw down their arms and declared Temüjin the rightful ruler of the steppe. For the first time, the majority of Mongolia acknowledged his claim. Jamukha himself escaped, but the war was effectively over. Temüjin had not merely defeated an opponent, he had broken the backbone of the old aristocracy. And in its place, he had built something entirely new, a meritocratic order held together not by bloodlines, but by loyalty and law. The steppe was unified in everything but name. The next chapter would give that unity its voice and its Khan. By the start of the 13th century, the steppe had grown strangely quiet. The wars that had torn Mongolia apart for decades, the ambushes, raids, and clan feuds began to fade into something the nomads barely recognized: stability. Temüjin's victories over Jamukha had done more than eliminate a rival. They had shattered a centuries-old system in which noble families ruled by entitlement and lineage. In the aftermath, clan after clan approached Temüjin not out of fear, but out of a sense of clarity. A new order was emerging, and they wanted to be part of it. Yet Temüjin refused to claim a title prematurely. He governed cautiously, consolidating alliances. He punished theft, protected the weak, and enforced discipline among his soldiers. Under his leadership, the steppe began to experience something rare: predictable justice. Stories spread quickly of widows receiving compensation for stolen horses, of poor herders finding protection against powerful nobles, of soldiers rewarded for bravery rather than bloodline. Such changes did not go unnoticed. By 1206, nearly every major clan on the steppe had pledged loyalty to him. It was time. That spring, the greatest assembly of Mongol leaders in living memory gathered on the banks of the Onon River. Thousands arrived: nobles, generals, herdsmen, families, each representing a piece of Mongolia's vast mosaic. They formed a great circle, a symbolic gesture showing that all voices were equal before the decision to be made. This was the Kurultai, the council that would decide Mongolia's future. At its center sat Temüjin. He did not arrive with the fanfare of a conqueror. He arrived simply, dressed in the robes of a steppe leader, as if reminding the world of where he had come from. Exile, hunger, humiliation, survival. His presence carried the weight of a man forged not by privilege, but by endurance. The speeches were brief. Rivalries had been settled. Loyalty had been earned. The outcome was inevitable. The assembled chiefs rose and proclaimed him Chinggis Khan, the universal ruler, the Khan of all who live in felt tents. This was not just a coronation. It was the birth of a nation. For centuries, the Mongols had been a collection of feuding tribes, each clan loyal only to itself, each noble fighting for personal prestige. But with a single declaration, that world disappeared. The steppe had a unified leader, one whose authority was not rooted in ancestry but in achievement. What followed was even more revolutionary. Chinggis Khan began to formalize laws that would govern the empire. He compiled customary traditions into a clear code later known as the Yasa, ensuring that justice would no longer depend on a noble's whim. He banned kidnapping of women, a practice that had defined steppe politics for generations. He forbade nobles from abusing their authority. And he demanded absolute loyalty from his generals. rewarding merit with promotions that could elevate even a former slave into leadership. To bind the clans together, he reorganized Mongolia into military units that ignored tribal boundaries. Families moved freely between tribes, dissolving old loyalties and forming a single Mongol identity. This was not just military reform, it was social engineering of extraordinary ambition. But none of this masked the reality that the peace of 1206 was temporary. Chinggis Khan did not unify Mongolia to rest. He unified it to prepare. Beyond the steppes stretched worlds filled with wealth and ancient feuds, civilizations that had long underestimated the nomads, the Tanguts of Western Xia, the Jin dynasty of northern China, the empires of Central Asia. All of them lay beyond the horizon, unaware that a new force disciplined, united, and driven by a singular will was rising. The Kurultai had proclaimed a leader. History would soon proclaim a conqueror. With Mongolia unified in 1206, Chinggis Khan faced a question few leaders ever asked, with genuine seriousness. What now? For generations, Mongol Khans had fought for dominance over the steppe. None had looked beyond it. But Chinggis Khan was not shaped by tradition. He was shaped by hunger, humiliation, and the conviction that a united people needed purpose, or they would quickly fracture back into the chaos he had just ended. His first target lay to the southwest, the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia. To the Mongols, the Tanguts represented something alien and intriguing. They possessed fortified cities, irrigation systems, written laws, and wealth built from centuries of trade along the Silk Road. Their society was everything the nomads were not: sedentary, structured, and prosperous. To Chinggis Khan, the Tanguts offered both a challenge and an opportunity. If Mongolia was to become something greater than a coalition of tribes, it needed external enemies to bind it together. And so, in 1207, he led his newly structured army toward the Tangut frontier. The Mongol warriors expected vast open plains. Instead, they encountered mountains, deserts, and fortified cities unlike anything they had ever seen. Siege warfare was not part of their tradition. But this did not deter Chinggis Khan. If the Mongols lacked a skill, he sought it out. He recruited engineers, Khitan, Chinese, and even Muslim specialists, men who understood catapults, battering rams, and the mathematics of fortification. The steppe was learning the science of conquest. The early clashes were a test of adaptation. Mongol horsemen swept across the countryside, clearing the open terrain with ease, but the cities stood firm. The walls of Wulahai, Karakoto, and other Tangut strongholds proved resistant to arrows and cavalry charges. Yet Chinggis Khan was not a man to be frustrated by stone and mortar. He methodically tightened his hold-cutting supply lines, capturing surrounding towns, and rotating his troops in long campaigns that tested their discipline. What emerged was a Mongol army more flexible than any force the steppe had produced. An army that could not only outrun its enemies, but outlast them. By 1209, the Tanguts sued for peace. They recognized Chinggis Khan's authority, sent hostages, and acknowledged Mongol supremacy. It was not yet a full conquest, but it was a declaration. The Mongol Empire had stepped beyond its borders and survived. Yet it was what happened during these campaigns, not the victory itself, that defined the future of the empire. For the first time, Mongol generals operated with autonomy under a unified command. Subutai, a rising star, demonstrated extraordinary instincts in scouting and flanking maneuvers. Jebi, once an enemy archer spared by Chinggis Khan for his courage, proved capable of lightning-fast raids that became legendary. Urgadai and Chagatai, the Khan's sons, learned the harsh discipline of command. The Mongol military machine was becoming an extension of Chinggis Khan's mind, nimble, coordinated, and brutally efficient. But the Tanguts also offered something less tangible, yet equally important: a glimpse of the wider world. Chinggis Khan now understood that beyond Mongolia lay kingdoms ruled by wealthy elites, protected by walls and sustained by trade. To him, they were not obstacles, they were potential tributaries of a new order. The Tangut submission strengthened his confidence. But it also drew the attention of another power to the south. The Jin dynasty, rulers of northern China, old masters of steppe diplomacy and formidable adversaries. Their envoys watched with quiet concern as Mongolia rose from obscurity to dominance. And deep within the Jin court, scholars and generals whispered the same unsettling question. Had the nomads found a leader unlike any before them? They had. And soon, the Jin would see the full extent of what that meant. The submission of the Tanguts had confirmed something Chinggis Khan had long suspected. Mongolia's destiny lay far beyond the steppe. But one great obstacle stood directly to the south, the Jin dynasty, rulers of northern China. To the Mongols, the Jin were both feared and familiar. For generations, Jin emperors had manipulated steppe politics, elevating some clans, suppressing others, and playing rival tribes against one another. They had once recognized Temüjin's ally Togrul, but later plotted to weaken him. Their empire was vast, their cities fortified, their armies disciplined. But in Chinggis Khan's eyes, the Jin had made a fatal mistake. In 1206, shortly after Mongolia unified, the Jin demanded the submission of the Mongols as vassals, an order that might once have been accepted. But Chinggis Khan was no longer a minor steppe chieftain. He was the leader of a nation, and the idea of kneeling to an emperor whose authority meant nothing beyond his borders was unthinkable. War was inevitable. In 1211, Chinggis Khan assembled a force unprecedented in Mongol history. Some chronicles speak of 100,000 warriors, men trained under his strict discipline, hardened by years of internal war, and bound by an identity far stronger than tribe or lineage. They rode south into Jin territory, crossing the Gobi Desert in a march that tested the limits of endurance. What awaited them was a revelation. The Jin fortifications were immense stone walls stretching across mountains, towers bristling with archers, and fortified passes that funneled invaders into deadly traps. Mongol horsemen, usually unstoppable on open fields, found their movement restricted. But where others saw barriers, Chinggis Khan saw opportunities. He divided his forces, sending Jebe, Subutai, and his sons on wide flanking maneuvers. They traversed mountain paths, thought impassable, driving herds of livestock before them to create dust clouds that confused Jin scouts. Deception became a weapon. When one Mongol detachment appeared in the east, Jin generals raced to reinforce that sector only to discover that another Mongol division was already striking from the west. The Jin army, superior in numbers and equipment, could not predict or match the Mongols' speed. Cities fell one by one. Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, became the symbol of the Mongol advance. The siege was long and brutal. The Mongols lacked food, and the defenders suffered equally. It became a contest of endurance, resolve, and discipline. Ultimately, in 1215, Zhongdu surrendered. Fires consumed parts of the city. Panic swept through the Jin court. The empire fractured. But the fall of Zhongdu did something far more important. It showed that the invincible walls of China could be breached by a force born of the steppe. The war continued for years. Chinggis Khan did not annihilate the Jin in one stroke. He weakened them systematically. His generals operated with autonomy, coordinating campaigns across vast distances. Subutai raided deep into the countryside. Jebe conducted lightning strikes that destroyed Jin supply lines. Even the Tanguts, previously submissive, were coerced into providing troops and resources. By 1216, the Jin were retreating south, abandoning their northern capitals in desperation. The Mongols pursued relentlessly, never allowing them to recover. Historians often describe this war as the moment Chinggis Khan stopped being merely a steppe conqueror and became a global force. It was not simply a war of expansion, it was a test of organizational genius. The Mongols operated across thousands of miles, with a coordination that dazzled and terrified observers. Yet amid these victories, the seeds of future conflict were quietly being planted. The Tanguts, once submissive, grew uneasy with the scale of Chinggis Khan's demands. Chinese warlords saw opportunities in the chaos. And in distant Central Asia, an even greater challenge was rising. The Khwarezmian Empire, wealthy, powerful, and arrogant enough to underestimate the Mongols. Chinggis Khan had defeated the Jin, but he had not yet met the enemy who would ignite the greatest campaign of his life. Even as the Jin dynasty crumbled, Chinggis Khan's attention drifted west toward the vast Khwarezmian Empire of Central Asia. It was a political giant, stretching from Persia to the Aral Sea, rich with trade, artisans, and fortified cities older than any Mongol memory. And unlike the Jin, Khwarezm was not weak, divided, or awaiting collapse. It was ambitious, confident, and newly strengthened under its ruler, Shah Muhammad II. Ironically, the disaster began not with armies but with merchants. By 1218, the Mongol Empire had reached the doorstep of Khwarezm. Chinggis Khan, recognizing the strategic value of trade, sent a caravan of merchants to the city of Otrar, bearing goods and ordinary wares. The caravan represented peace, not war. But the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, saw only suspicion. He accused the merchants of espionage, seized their goods, and executed them. When news reached Chinggis Khan, he did not respond with rage. He responded with diplomacy. He sent 3 envoys, a senior ambassador, and 2 Mongol agents with a simple request: punish the governor and restore the peace. Shah Muhammad chose humiliation instead. He executed the Mongol ambassador, shaved the beards of the others a profound insult, and sent them back with a message that left no ambiguity. Khwarezm would not be intimidated by nomads. The insult was complete. What followed would become one of the most devastating campaigns in medieval history. Chinggis Khan mobilized an army estimated by some chronicles at 150,000 men, an extraordinary force benchmarked by discipline rather than numbers. His generals Jebe, Subutai, Tolui, and Jochi led divisions that could operate independently for months, coordinating through a system of relay riders capable of crossing hundreds of miles in days. The Mongols crossed into Khwarezm like a storm breaking over dry earth. Otrar fell first. The governor who caused the catastrophe was captured alive. According to Persian sources, molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment not born of Mongol custom, but of the rage of local populations who had suffered his corruption. Chinggis Khan allowed the revenge to proceed. The message was clear. Justice for the Mongols would be absolute. From there, the Mongol armies split into multiple fronts. Jebe and Subutai swept west, cutting off escape routes. Tolui, Chinggis Khan's youngest son, led brutal sieges against fortified cities. Chinggis Khan himself advanced through Transoxiana, capturing Bukhara and Samarkand in rapid succession. The fall of Bukhara is remembered with a mixture of dread and awe. The city surrendered quickly, but its citadel resisted. After breaching the walls, Chinggis Khan entered the city's great mosque. He did not gloat. He simply stood before the trembling leaders and said, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Persian historians preserved those words with a chill that lingers to this day. By 1220, the Khwarezmian Empire had been shattered. Shah Muhammad fled west, dying in isolation on an island in the Caspian Sea, pursued to the end by Jebe and Subutai. His son, Jalal al-Din, fought valiantly but was driven into India. The Mongol victory was total, but it came with a cost. The brutality of these campaigns left a mark even on Chinggis Khan's own officers. Cities resisted and were destroyed. Populations fled and were hunted. The destruction reshaped Central Asia for generations. For Chinggis Khan, this war was not simply expansion, it was vengeance. A message to the world that Mongol envoys were sacred, and killing them meant annihilation. By the time the campaign ended, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to the Persian heartlands. No nomadic leader had ever accomplished anything comparable. But even at the height of triumph, something darker was approaching. The Tanguts, once submissive allies, had refused Chinggis Khan's call for additional troops during the Khwarezm campaign. Their defiance would not be forgotten. And the man who had conquered half the known world was about to face the final chapter of his life. When the Khwarezmian Empire collapsed under the weight of Mongol armies, Chinggis Khan stood at the height of his power. His empire stretched across a continent, his generals operated with a unity unseen in steppe history, and his enemies, those still breathing, spoke his name with a trembling mixture of awe and dread. Yet even at this moment of triumph, Chinggis Khan was not finished. He had one final score to settle. Years earlier, the Tanguts of Western Shah had submitted to Mongol rule, but during the Khwarezm campaign, when Chinggis Khan called upon them for troops and provisions, they refused. To the Tanguts, it was a pragmatic decision. To Chinggis Khan, it was betrayal, and betrayal, in his world, demanded a response. So in 1226, he turned his armies back toward the southwest, toward the kingdom that had once bowed to him. It was not a vast campaign, nor a monumental clash of empires. It was a deliberate, methodical demonstration of Mongol resolve. The Tanguts, weakened by internal strife and overconfident in their walls and mountain terrain, found themselves facing a leader whose persistence outweighed his enemies' hopes. Mongol forces advanced through harsh desert landscapes. They dammed rivers to flood Tangut cities. They starved strongholds into submission. Chinggis Khan coordinated the campaign with the same meticulous discipline that had crushed Khwarezm, but this time his motivation was personal. The Tanguts had broken their oath, and to him, an empire that survived on mutual loyalty could not tolerate open defiance. It was during this campaign that fate delivered its final blow. After decades spent riding in bitter cold, scorching heat, and endless campaigns, the Khan, now in his 60s, fell ill. The cause remains uncertain. Some sources speak of fever. Others whisper of injuries from hunting. The truth is lost to time. But what is clear is this: even as weakness overtook him, he demanded that the campaign continue. And it did. Western Sia fell in early 1227. The Tangut capital was destroyed. Its rulers surrendered. Its dynasty vanished. It was the final conquest of Chinggis Khan's life, completed almost at the moment his strength left him. In a camp somewhere near the Liupan Mountains, surrounded by his sons, generals, and trusted advisors, Chinggis Khan died later that same year. The news was concealed perhaps for weeks, perhaps for months, until the army returned home. His burial place remains unknown. No monument was raised. No palace marked his tomb. Only silence. What he left behind was not a grave, but a world transformed. Under his rule, a nomadic people once dismissed as scattered tribes became the core of the largest contiguous empire in human history. Trade routes reopened. Merchants traveled with passports bearing the seal of the Khan. Messages crossed continents in days rather than months. Religious tolerance became policy, not exception. Law, consistent, predictable, and enforced bound disparate cultures under a single order. Yet his legacy is not simple. The empire's expansion brought destruction, displacement, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The cities of Khwarezm never fully recovered. Entire populations were uprooted. The Mongol peace of the 13th century was built with both vision and violence. And still, 8 centuries later, the world he reshaped continues to echo with his presence. His sons and grandsons would carry his empire further into China, into the Middle East, into Europe. Kublai Khan would found the Yuan dynasty, Batu would overrun Russia and Hungary. Hulagu would topple Baghdad. The world after Chinggis Khan was a different world entirely. The boy born holding a clot of blood had changed the course of continents. And as the dust of his final campaign settled, one truth remained. Chinggis Khan had reshaped the world not only through conquest, but through the unshakable will of a man who refused to accept the limits of the world he was born into. If this story moved you, remember this: history is full of moments that changed everything, and leaders who rose from nothing to shape the destiny of millions. Join me again as we uncover the next chapter of our world's hidden past.